from Matthew 14, 3-12, whatever I wanted. Nothing was my fault. You can blame my mother, who had it in for John the Baptist from the get-go. How dare he criticize her and my uncle and now stepfather's relationship? I love the king too in many ways, although he's kind of a wuss. And if truth be told, his wife left him and not the other way around. When he told me I could have anything I wanted, what better way did I have of making them both happy, and me too in my future? So blame the two of them. I was only 12 years old. Or blame John himself, who should have known not to challenge the establishment. Or blame that Jesus guy who talked funny in parables no one got, even his so-called disciples. By the way, no one else judged me. I lived a long time, had 2 husbands and even children who were good citizens. To my surprise, even a little dull for me, Salome, who loved sex and gore. Like you, behold John's head in your books and art, and my naked body stripped of all its veils. Thank you.
This is called Paison, A Story of War. It is an excerpt from the beginning of my next novel. 17-year-old Luigi Bartoni was a young man living in 2 very distinct worlds. One foot was firmly planted in the American world of baseball, chewing gum, girls, and fast cars. At school, Luigi was an average student, typical of most boys his age. He dozed through history and biology and struggled with algebra. But Luigi came alive in art class. A pencil or a piece of charcoal was a magic wand in his hands. The images he drew sprang from the page as if he somehow blew life into them through his fingers. Luigi was also a magician on the baseball field. Put him in the outfield with a glove in his hands and nothing got by him. It was almost as if he were a magnet and the ball a piece of iron. He was the star player on his high school team and loved to show off in front of the girls. Luigi so identified with everything American to the point that he often introduced himself as Lou Barton when he met someone new. But the everything American world was not Luigi Bartoni's only world. The minute he stepped into his house, his world became Italian in every sense of the word, from the enticing aromas emanating from the kitchen, to the Italian language newspaper on the table, to every word spoken. The explanation for this everything Italian world could be given in one word: Nonna. Luigi's grandmother controlled everything in the multi-generational household. Giuseppina Corti married Fortunato Bartoni in 1881 in Salerno, Italy. She was 16. Fortunato was 22. 9 months later, Giuseppina gave birth to twin boys, followed 11 months later by a 3rd son. 2 years later, the couple celebrated the birth of their only daughter. Times were hard and jobs were scarce. When the flour mill where he was employed went bankrupt in 1898, Fortunato could not find other work. Gathering what little money he had and borrowing what few lira he could from family members, he announced to his wife that they were emigrating to the United States. Giuseppina was livid. There was absolutely no way she was going to leave her beloved Italy. No amount of cajoling on the part of her husband and 3 sons had any effect. Finally, unable to find an alternative, Fortunato tied Giuseppina to her favorite chair, and he and their 3 sons carried her aboard the Italian steamship Principe. Giuseppina was 6 months pregnant at the time. In her hands, she carried a small glass jar filled with dirt from her yard. Giuseppina was no easier to live with once they arrived in New York. She wore only black, declaring she would live her life in mourning for her homeland. She adamantly refused to speak a word of English, refused to have anything to do with the world outside her door, and ruled her household with an iron fist and a stout cane. Fortunato, always a gentle man, broke under her unrelenting hatred. Giuseppina decreed that her family's penance for their betrayal of Italy, and her, was that they would all remain at home and take care of her. "None of you will ever leave me," she declared. I will allow no wives to take my son's attentions from me, nor will I allow a man to take my daughter from this house. I will not be abandoned in this foreign land. As the years passed, she grew even harsher and more rigid in her hatred of America. In her bedroom, she did not share the room with Fortunato. She erected what could only be called a shrine around the small glass jar filled with Italian soil. Giuseppina would not leave the house, even to attend Mass at the Catholic Church only 2 blocks away, so she lit candles, burned incense, and knelt to pray 3 times a day in front of her precious piece of Italy. As she had decreed, she continued to refuse to allow her 3 oldest sons to marry, and she drove away the few suitors who ever showed an interest in her daughter. Only when her youngest son, Pasquale, admittedly the apple of her eye, begged her to allow him to marry, did she relent. But even Pasquale did not escape her control, as Giuseppina demanded that he and his wife, and any children they might have, must continue to live under her roof. Whether or not the constraints caused by this decree had anything to do with it, Pasquale and his wife, Teresa, only had 1 child, Luigi, born in November 1924. Nana did not recognize the birth of her only grandson until she was presented with a copy of his birth certificate in Italian. That this was accomplished through less than official means was not mentioned. Luigi was 6 years old before he learned to speak English, and it was years before he realized that he now thought in English without first mentally translating his words from Italian. Once exposed to the American world, however, nothing could stop him from absorbing all that New York had to offer. Giuseppina followed Benito Mussolini's rise to power in Italy with fervent ardor. A huge color photograph of Il Duce dominated the dining room, and Mussolini's avowedly fascist newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, arrived on a weekly basis from the old country. As tensions in Europe grew in the late 1930s, Giuseppina also became an ardent supporter of Adolf Hitler once her beloved Mussolini joined forces with the Nazi dictator. Each week, it seemed, she had something new to rejoice over as the fascist Nazi pack ravaged Europe. The first time Luigi pointed out that the New York Times reported an entirely different version of one of his grandmother's triumphs, she sent him from the table. The second time he attempted to contradict her, she beat him with her cane and refused to speak to him for over a week. This, then, was the dual world Luigi Bartoni found himself living in on December 7, 1941. It was a glorious Sunday, and after mandatory attendance at early morning Mass, Luigi was standing in the driveway, lovingly polishing his 1931 Ford Roadster. He had saved every penny he could for nearly 4 years in order to buy it the previous week. Today, he planned to pick up his girlfriend Gertie and take a drive along the recently completed Hutchinson River Parkway. Luigi frowned when he thought of Gertie. Nana approved of her, but Luigi was getting tired of Gertie's strident anti-American rhetoric. Her father was high up in the American Nazi Party and was as fervent a supporter of the German-Italian partnership as Giuseppina. The only thing they disagreed on, it seemed, was how they referred to the relationship. Nana insisted it was an Italian-German pact, and Mr. Mueller was equally insistent that the Germans always be referred to first. Mr. Mueller had spent the first 20 or so years of his life in Germany, so Luigi guessed he could somewhat understand the man's dedication to the country of his birth. But Gertie had been born right here in New York. Luigi didn't understand how anyone raised in America could be anything but pro-American. Nevertheless, Gertie was a great kisser and good-looking, so he guessed he'd put up with her for a while longer. He gave a final loving pat to his car and headed to Gertie's house. By noon, they were out of the city traffic and enjoying the drive. It had been unseasonably warm for the last several days, and today was no exception. The sun was shining, the snow had melted everywhere, and the road was free of ice. The radio was tuned to WNYC, and they were listening to Chattanooga Choo Choo by Glenn Miller and his orchestra. The song had only been released the day before, but it was already being touted as a #1 hit. "How do they know it's going to be #1? Gertie asked. "It's an okay song, but I don't think it's all that great, do you?" Luigi mumbled a non-reply, his attention elsewhere. He was looking for a place they could pull off the road and do a little necking. He didn't get a lot of chances to get Gertie alone, and he didn't want to waste it. He reached over and turned off the radio, having just spotted a likely-looking spot. He made sure he was well off the pavement, then reached behind him to retrieve 2 blankets and a bottle of his grandfather's wine he'd smuggled out of the cellar. "Come on, Gertie, let's get comfortable," he suggested. "It's too cold," she whined. Luigi flashed her what he thought was a sexy grin. "I'll keep you warm, babe," he promised. Gertie thought his grin made him look at best silly and at worst lecherous, but she did like the way he kissed. She climbed out of the car, and together they walked into the trees until they found a small clearing about 100 yards from the road. Luigi spread one of the blankets on the ground, sat down, and patted the blanket. He reached for the wine bottle and grinned up at her as he pulled out the cork. Gertie kicked off her shoes and snuggled next to him. "Use the other blanket, Luigi. I'm freezing." Luigi did as requested, and they proceeded to share Fortunato's wine, along with lots of kissing. Typical of most teenage relationships, Luigi tried to get to second base, as his baseball friends called it, and Gertie kept trying to fend off his roving hands. She and her girlfriends all agreed that it was okay for good girls to allow guys to fondle their breasts outside their clothing, but anything below the waist was strictly hands-off. But of course, kissing was just fine. After half an hour or so of Luigi pleading for more, and Gertie staunchly resisting, both were tired out. Luigi stretched out on the blanket, one arm behind his head for a pillow and the other arm wrapped around Gertie, tucked tightly in at his side. Never one to be silent for long, Gertie almost immediately began to talk. "I really like your car, Luigi. It's nicer than any of the other boys." "Thanks. I got a sweetheart deal on it. Jimmy O'Brien's cousin was selling it so he could buy something a little newer. Jimmy knew I'd been saving for a car and gave me his cousin's number. He wanted $100, but I talked him down to 90. Luigi said it as if it was bragging, not telling Gertie that $90 was all he'd managed to save. "Well, $90 is still a lot of money. What did you do to earn so much? I didn't think you had a job." "I'm an entrepreneur," Luigi said boastfully. "I work for myself. See, there's lots of Jewish people where I live, and most of them are really Jewish, if you know what I mean. Their Sabbath starts at sundown on Friday and runs through sundown on Saturday, and they're not allowed to do anything that's not religious all that time. They can't even turn a light switch on or off. So what I do is I go around to all of the apartments I know about and turn on their lights, and then I go back later that night and turn them all off." "And they pay you to do that?" "Yep, they each give me a nickel every Friday, and I do 20 apartments. I also carry groceries for them, and several of the ladies have me wash their windows once a month." "You don't mind working for those people?" Luigi sighed. Here we go again, he thought. More hate propaganda parroted from her father. But Luigi didn't feel like arguing right now, so all he said was, "I didn't tell you the best part. They feed me too." At a little over 6 feet tall and weighing only about 125 pounds, Luigi was all legs and arms. Long legs and arms. "They all tell me I'm too skinny and that I need to eat more. Mrs. Baumgartner gives me strudel or apple cake when I wash her windows, and Mr. Kleinfeld owns the deli down the street, so Mrs. Kleinfeld always has a pastrami on rye sandwich for me with the biggest dill pickle you've ever seen. Just thinking about it makes my mouth water." Gertie had to laugh. She was well aware of just how hungry Luigi was, but he seemed to burn it off. He gave off body heat like a furnace. And speaking of heat, after another round of kissing, the young couple gathered up the blankets and the empty wine bottle and climbed back into the car. Luigi made a U-turn and began the drive back to the city. Only a minute or so had passed before a police car, its siren blaring, pulled up beside them. The policeman gestured for them to pull over. "You two have a radio in that car?" the policeman asked when Luigi pulled over and rolled down the window. "Yes, sir, but it's turned off." "Well, then that's probably why you're out here when you should be home. Don't you know the Japanese just bombed Pearl Harbor?" "Pearl Harbor? Where's that?" Gertie asked. Her grasp of geography, other than European, was less than brilliant. "Why, middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's where all our ships for the Pacific were stationed. You two get on home. Word has it they may try to attack us here, too." Luigi thought that was unlikely, given they were 2,800 miles from the west coast, and Hawaii was another 3,000 miles west of that. but he agreed that getting home as quickly as possible was probably a good idea. "Thanks for telling us," he said politely. "We'll go home right away." Back on the road, their conversation naturally turned to the prospect of war. "Roosevelt's got to get us into the war now," Luigi said with assurance. "Don't be too sure," Gertie cautioned. "My father says Americans won't fight. He says they're all cowards and just want to bury their heads in the sand. He says—" "But what about you?" Luigi interrupted. He was all too aware of her father's opinions. Gertie stated them with the same reverence most people used when speaking about God. "What do you think, Gertie? After all, you were born here, just like I was." Pause. No answer. Then, "My father says Germany's bound to win the war. No one can possibly defeat the Fuhrer, and Italy will be right there, sharing the glory. And even if America's at war with Japan, that doesn't mean they'll interfere in Europe. They can't hit Europe from here, and once England falls, there's no place in Europe they could fight from. Once Germany controls all of Europe, they'll come here. In just a few years, those of us who are worthy will be living in the glorious 1,000-year Reich." Luigi could hear the capital letters when she said it. "I don't think you're giving us enough credit," he argued. "Us? What do you mean, us? I'm German and you're Italian. Surely you want our side to win, don't you?" "You can listen to your father and his hatred all you want, Gertie, but me, I'm an American. When I fight, it'll be for America. And not because I hate anybody or think any race or religion deserves less than anybody else. I'll fight because I don't think any one man or government has the right to tell the entire world how they have to live. I won't fight because I hate, Gertie. I'll fight because I love. I love America and all it stands for." Neither said much more after that, but Luigi knew what to expect when he got home. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the possible consequences were the only topics discussed in the Bartoni household that day. The following day, they all gathered around the radio to listen to President Roosevelt as he addressed Congress. "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace." The next few words were lost when Jessipina snorted, "Peace, right." When the president's speech ended, Luigi said, "I don't understand, Nana. You don't believe we wanted peace with Japan? Italy wants peace with Japan. They are our allies. But America?" Jessipina looked as if she wanted to spit out something bitter. "Who knows what Roosevelt and his cronies wanted? But they have a war now. Whoa, no. It'll keep their attention off our victory in Europe." When the United States declared war on Germany and Italy on December 11, after those countries declared war on the United States, Jessipina just shook her head. "Too little, too late. Il Duce and the Fuhrer are unstoppable," she declared. "I'm going to enlist," Luigi announced at dinner that night. "You're only 17, his mother protested. "You're too young." "Well, they'll take me if you or father sign the papers," Luigi told her. "I will help you get to Italy," Jessipina told him. "Italy? I'm not going to Italy, Nana." Jessipina scowled when he added, "There's a recruiting office downtown next to the post office." "You are telling me you are going to fight for America?" "Absolutamente no. I forbid it. You will fight for your country, our country. You will fight for Italy." Luigi was ready to protest when, surprisingly, his grandfather spoke. Nonno rarely said a word, especially when in the same room with Jessipina. "You just turned 17, grandson, and no one in this family will give permission for you to join any army before you turn 18. We will continue this discussion then." Most of 1942 was spent in a verbal tug-of-war between Luigi and his grandmother. She crowed when Singapore fell to the Japanese in February, and her delight was even greater when news came of the surrender of all U.S. forces in the Philippines in May. But it was Luigi's turn to celebrate when, on June 14, the New York Times announced that the British Army had crossed the Egyptian-Libyan border and captured the Italian stronghold Fort Capuzzo. When Benito Mussolini declared that the Mediterranean Sea was Mare Nostrum, our sea, Jessipina echoed his words. "Under Il Duce," she declared, "my beloved Italy will once again be a world power, greater even than the Roman Empire. How can you deny your heritage? You must fight for Italy. Privately, Luigi thought she even looked like Mussolini when she echoed his words. When Luigi tried to talk with Gertie about the tug-of-war at home and explain his desire to join the U.S. Army, Gertie sided with Giuseppina. Don't be a fool, Luigi, she admonished. Your grandmother is correct. You want to be on the winning side, don't you? When he hesitated, she added, my husband must support the Axis powers. Husband? Luigi stammered. Well, of course we'll be married before you leave, Luigi. Gertie spoke as if everything had already been proposed, accepted, and decided. As the war news went from bad to worse for America and Great Britain throughout 1942, with the exception of the much vaunted Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April, everyone in the Bartoni household, except for Luigi, continued to doubt that the Allies would be victorious. He watched as one after the other of his high school friends joined one of the U.S. military branches, and he mourned when news came of the death of some of them. Finally, the day of Luigi's 18th birthday arrived, Monday, November 16, 1942. Now the decision about his participation in the war could be made. Had anyone asked him 9 months, 6 months, or even 3 months earlier what he was going to do, he would have said without hesitation, I am enlisting in the United States Army. But months of Giuseppina's pro-Italian propaganda, backed by every member of his family, as well as Gertie, some actively, some passively, but none verbally disagreeing, had eroded Luigi's determination and left him feeling unsure of himself. The everything American world he had been so happy in only a year ago was being overshadowed by the everything Italian life he was force-fed every day at home. His mother's gift to him that night was a hand-knit sweater. His father gave him a pocket knife, and his aunt and his 3 uncles each gave him a crisp $5 bill. For your trip, his Uncle Nunzio told him. Luigi turned to his grandmother, wondering what her gift would be. There was no package on the table, but there was an envelope, so he guessed she was also giving him money. He was mistaken. Luigi, you are 18, and as promised, the family will now allow you to fight for your country. She held up the envelope and continued. You will leave next week on the Portuguese ship Santa Liberdade. In Lisbon, you will be met by my cousin Enzo, who will take you home to Salerno with him. She paused to rub her thumb across the fingers on one hand, the universally understood gesture for a bribe. It has been arranged. The government will overlook the misfortune of your American birth, and you will be allowed to enlist in the glorious Italian army. Luigi was stunned by the silence that followed this announcement. Surely someone would object, his mother, his father, but no one at the table, other than his grandmother, would meet his eyes. The decision was no longer his to make. Lou Barton knew he had been defeated. As the ship pulled away from the pier and began its long journey out of the harbor and across the Atlantic, Luigi Bartoni stood silently on the upper deck, oblivious to the weight of the wet snow settling on his head and shoulders. His hands gripped the cold steel of the railing, and the tears falling silently from his eyes froze halfway down his cheeks. Standing tall and majestic, Lady Liberty, in her green robes, seemed to berate him as the ship passed her island. In Luigi's mind, he heard her accuse, "What have you done?" Well, happens to be World War II, which is kind of good today since we're honoring what was Veterans Day on the 11th. This one I have read several times to get ready to read. I have the great honor of having been asked by Mike to read one of his 2 submissions. And I will admit that how long this one takes to read depends on how often I have to stop and wipe my tears, because I cannot read this one without crying, and you will see why. This is an outstanding story. It's called The Salvation of Edward Wilson by Michael Raff. This story is in memory of Uncle Eddie, Uncle Eb, Uncle Frank, Uncle Joe, and Dad. December 6, 2011, Honolulu, Hawaii. Following his daughter Carolyn and grandchild Nicole, Edward Wilson stepped from the jet walk and entered the Honolulu International Airport. Except for the cramped seating, their flight had been uneventful. His back ached, and once again he had to go to the bathroom. It was strange, but after all these years, his scars began burning the moment their plane touched down. "You okay, Grandpa?" his 18-year-old granddaughter asked as they headed toward the baggage area. It was her first time in Hawaii, and her eyes teemed with enthusiasm. Almost everyone considered Oahu paradise, but no way could Edward relate. "I'm not too bad," he answered. "Nothing a pit stop wouldn't help." Lugging her own and Edward's carry-ons, Carolyn peered at him in exasperation. "Geez, Dad, didn't you just go to the men's room when we landed?" Edward nearly tripped over his cane. He'd gone 88 years walking just fine. Then suddenly something fizzled in his brain. Dr. Barrett had called it a minor cerebrovascular accident. If it was minor, Edward wanted no part of a major one. "Yeah, well, you don't have a prostate," he grumbled. Truth be known, he was embarrassed about having to go to the bathroom so often. "Thank goodness for small favors," Carolyn responded. "There are plenty of restrooms on the way to the baggage area." She and Nicole turned left, and Edward nearly lost sight of them. The airport was crowded, people everywhere, some of them Japanese. Edward cringed and grew wary. Not a veteran or a serviceman in sight. What was he doing here? He'd told Carolyn 100 times he didn't want to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the worst day in American history. He groaned and shook his head. He needed a hefty shot of booze, and it wasn't going to happen. He'd worked too hard to quit. He sighed and forced himself to keep up with his family. Edward ambled up to the sink and washed his hands. When did they get so wrinkled? They looked like they'd been soaking in water for hours. He gazed into the mirror and adjusted the veteran's cap featuring the USS West Virginia name in bold lettering. He'd told Carolyn he didn't want to wear it, but as usual, she insisted. He took a long look at himself in the mirror. His bloodshot eyes were sinking into his skull. His cheeks had grown hollow, and gray stubble thrived among the crevices. It was a miracle his face hadn't shattered the mirror. By the color of his skin, people were going to think he'd been locked in a closet for weeks on end. As his dear old grandmother used to say, "It's hell growing old." Straightening, Edward glanced about. Not another soul around. He peered deeper into the mirror, and his wife Mary stood before him, looking as sad as he'd ever seen her, but young again, wearing the lavender dress she was buried in. She'd been visiting him ever since the so-called minor accident. "I don't want to be here," he muttered. "I know," Mary whispered. "It brings back more memories than I can deal with." "I know," she repeated. "Try to make the best of it. It could very well help you." A man and a boy rushed in wearing matching green and blue Hawaiian shirts. Mary disappeared, plunging Edward's mood into an abyss. Sighing, he dried his hands with a paper towel. He'd better not keep his family waiting. If he wasn't so darn decrepit, he would jump ship. Carolyn pulled the rented Honda into the parking lot of the Tropical Reef Hotel and drove toward the entrance. Traffic had been awful. Other than Diamond Head, Edward hadn't recognized a single landmark. Except for the humidity, Oahu had changed dramatically. "We have a full day tomorrow, Dad," Carolyn said. "What else would you like to do while you're here?" Edward shrugged. "I don't know." "Come on, Grandpa," Nicole exclaimed. "It's so beautiful here, and there's so much to do. There's got to be something you'd like to see." Of Edward's 4 grandchildren, Nicole was the youngest, and although a tomboy, his favorite. Maybe that cemetery," he murmured. "The one they call the Punch Bowl." The Tropical Reef was a newly renovated hotel located by the beach in Waikiki. It featured a spacious lobby and lengthy corridors. Edward felt out of place. Carolyn registered them at the front desk while he and Nicole settled into a pair of cushy chairs. Down the corridor, he spotted the banquet hall where the reunion would take place tomorrow night. A sign in front of the room's double doors read, "The Tropical Reef presents the USS West Virginia's 70th reunion." Playing Hawaiian music from across the corridor, Aloha Harry's Restaurant and Bar featured another sign boasting great food and great drinks. "This is so exciting, Grandpa," gushed Nicole. "Thanks for letting me tag along." Edward turned his attention to his granddaughter. He wanted to tell the teenager how happy he was she was able to join them and how much he loved her, but all that came out was a feeble, "My pleasure." An alarm sounded over the PA system, so shrill, so ear-piercing, that it woke the 18-year-old Edward from a deep slumber. He jumped out of his hammock and threw on his pants and shirt, as did hundreds of other sailors, their clamoring evolving into rampant chaos. Battle stations, a grim voice demanded over the PA. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Adding to the turmoil, the ship suddenly lurched. What was that? A sailor cried. We're hit, hollered another seaman. We're under attack. Get topside, on the double, commanded an ensign. Crammed in like sardines, all trying to get to the ladders, the sailors could barely move. Edward was unable to see past the men surrounding him. Jimmy, where are you? He yelled. We got to get to our battle station. I'm here, Eddie, his lifelong friend shouted from behind. Don't worry, good buddy. We're going to be all right. Edward woke up gasping for breath, covered in sweat. His heart throbbed. Trembling, he peered into the darkness. He was alone in bed in a strange room. Struggling to his feet, he caught his breath. Reality trickled in. He was in a hotel in Oahu, in the smaller of 2 bedrooms. Carolyn had wanted him to sleep in the master bedroom, but he'd insisted on the smaller one. A grim realization sank in. Although he hadn't had a nightmare in years, this one was not only unrelenting, but dreadfully realistic. But why now? He sighed, knowing the answer. Because of Pearl. How stupid of him. He knew he shouldn't have come. Now he would have to pay the price. Someone knocked on the door. Carolyn stepped into the room. Dad, are you all right? Edward cringed. He could barely see her within the darkness. Yeah, I'm fine. Did you have a nightmare? No. But Nicole and I heard you shouting. It's nothing. I'm fine. He returned to his bed. Carolyn stood in the middle of the room, her hands on her hips. Do you know how many times during my childhood I heard you having nightmares and you telling Mom it was nothing? Why don't you ever talk about them? What have you got to lose? Edward rolled away from her. Go back to bed, Carolyn. Get some sleep. I'll see you tomorrow. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 2011. Gray cumulus clouds crept over the sun. Wearing their finest dress uniforms, a dozen sailors saluted from the stage. Off to the side, a lone seaman played taps on a brass bugle. There had been numerous speakers, the governor of Hawaii, the mayor of Honolulu, a retired rear admiral, and officials from Veterans Affairs and the Navy Department. A handful of Pearl Harbor survivors followed, most of them in wheelchairs, their bodies shriveled with age. What the veterans had to say became a blur to Edward, but their expressions were all the same. They had suffered untold trauma. There were about 100 chairs facing the stage, which was flanked by a museum, theater, and gift shops. Edward, Carolyn, and Nicole had arrived too late to find seats. Despite Edward's protests, a teenager had insisted he should take his chair. Standing tall, the teen had saluted him. Thank you for your service, sir, he proclaimed. Edward appreciated the gesture, but felt embarrassed just the same. Down the row of chairs, he spotted several Japanese families. What were they doing here? At least 2 of the men appeared old enough to have been at Pearl Harbor, dropping bombs and torpedoing the battleships. One man, with a crew cut and dark circles under his eyes, peered at him and nodded. Edward winced and looked away. How unacceptable. Of all the times and places, why were they allowed to attend? After the ceremony, Edward, Carolyn, and Nicole browsed through the museum before entering the theater to watch a documentary about the attack. Edward had to calm himself. Just as he'd imagined, this was a needless exercise of stirring up the past. After the documentary, they boarded the shuttle that crossed the harbor to the memorial, and a journey Edward dreaded the most. He'd lost his sea legs years ago and needed help getting on and off the craft, rendering him even more embarrassment. They only had a short time once inside. Edward admired the white concrete structure with 21 windows all along the walls and ceiling, an almost otherworldly memorial straddled above the remains of the Arizona. He couldn't bring himself to look at what was left of the wreck. Instead, he peered beyond its stern, where the West Virginia had been moored on December 7, 1941. He recalled how his ship had been repaired and brought back into action, fighting gallantly at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, only to be sold for scrap in 1959. Carolyn and Nicole led Edward to the shrine. Standing before the towering wall with over 1,100 names engraved on its surface, Edward could barely sustain his breath. When he spotted Smitty's name, it felt as if he'd been punched in the chest. Smitty's remains were still on the Arizona. His childhood friend felt so close, so real. His face had carved itself into his memory, an image of freckles, curly hair, and a broad, crooked smile. He was only 18 on that fateful morning, the same age as Edward at the time, the same age as Nicole. The remainder of the day became a blur. Carolyn offered to take her father to the USS Missouri and the submarine Bowfin, but an exhausted Edward asked to leave. "Dad, how about stopping by the Punch Bowl?" Carolyn inquired after they'd climbed into the rental. "It's on the way back. You said you wanted to go." Edward peered at a man in the parking lot wearing Navy fatigues who was helping a wheelchair vet into a car. 70 years. Where did they go? "Maybe another time," he murmured. His daughter nodded and smiled. "Okay, but I'm going to take you up on that." Nicole leaned forward behind Edward. "You're right, Grandpa. Save your energy for tonight's reunion. You're going to have a blast." Cringing, Edward slouched and stared out the window. He felt devastated, completely overwhelmed, and this was just the beginning. After returning to their hotel room, Edward said he needed to lay down for a while. Always eager to please, his granddaughter promised to wake him in time for the reunion. Edward usually didn't dream while taking a nap, but today had been exceptional. He found himself back on the West Virginia, December 7th, 1941. He and Jimmy had retrieved their assigned fire hose. One of the fires was raging out of control near the forward gun turret. The heat grew unbearable. Japanese Zeros were everywhere, dropping bombs on Battleship Row, strafing their decks with machine gun fire. A sailor running toward them was struck in the neck and toppled overboard. Edward knew he would be dead by the time he hit the water. Before they could make headway with the flames, a bomb struck the Arizona, followed by a tremendous explosion. In his entire lifetime, Edward would never experience a sound so dreadful. He didn't know then, but the time was 8:06 a.m. Jimmy, his face blackened, cried, "Eddie, that's Smitty's ship." "Yeah, I know," cried Edward, a bullet whizzing by his head. "Just keep it steady. Aim low and inch back. The fire's creeping up on the turret." The crew fought valiantly, but all the weapons had been knocked out. They didn't stand a chance. Sailors were screaming. Bullets riddled the deck surrounding them. "Why is this happening?" Edward asked himself. "We didn't do anything. We're not at war." That was when he spotted the torpedo headed their way. "Time to get up, Grandpa!" The fuzzy image of Edward's granddaughter stood above him. He flew up in bed, his heart pounding, his scars burning, his forehead covered in sweat. "What did you say?" Nicole stopped beside him, an expression of concern distorting her angelic face. "You okay, Grandpa? You were having one doozy of a nightmare." Trying to catch his breath, Edward scooted to the edge of the bed. "Yes, I'm fine, sweetheart. Never better. Now scram, I gotta get dressed." If Carolyn hadn't been so insistent, Edward would have skipped the reunion. He struggled into his suit and tie for the first time since Mary's funeral. He'd lost weight, the jacket hung on him, and the pants were baggy. Because it didn't go well with the suit, he left his veteran's cap on the bed. The banquet hall was just downstairs. All they had to do was step into the elevator. 3 receptionists sat at the entrance behind a table. "Hello," a woman of 40 greeted. She handed him his plastic name badge. "I see this is your first time with us. Welcome, we're honored to have you." Edward nodded and forced a smile. "Dad's not keen on veteran activities," Carolyn interjected. "We practically had to kidnap him and drag him onto the plane." "Well, I'm glad you did," the woman replied. "There aren't that many vets left to attend these events. I'm sure he'll feel differently once he's inside." After an introduction by the hotel manager and a pair of Navy officials, dinner was served. When the waiter asked Edward what he wanted to drink, he answered, "Just a Coke, please." "Why don't you splurge and have a Mai Tai or something? It'll help you relax," Carolyn suggested. Edward hung his head. "That's not a good idea, sweetheart." "Dad, forget about it. That was a long time ago. Nothing happened." Edward cleared his throat and peered at the waiter. "Just a Coke, please," he repeated. Nicole glanced back and forth between them, confusion gleaming in her eyes. Carolyn raved how delicious the prime rib and mashed potatoes tasted. Edward hardly tasted a thing. Since turning 80, his appetite had diminished. After dinner and another 2 speeches, the same retired admiral from the morning held roll call for the survivors, then requested their presence on stage. There were only 7. Nicole clapped her hands and beamed. Carolyn peered at her father in blatant trepidation. Edward sighed, retrieved his cane, and followed the other vets to the stage. Well-intended or not, he would bear this indignity, take a bow, and not disappoint his family. Even with a ramp for those confined in wheelchairs, it took a while for the survivors to line up. Edward realized he was one of the youngest. The overwhelming majority of the seamen on December 7th had been less than 20 years old. He tried standing behind his peers, but one of the officials nudged him forward. The audience were on their feet, clapping and cheering. Edward felt his face flushing. How horrible, worse than he had imagined. A bad feeling rampaged through him, and he didn't know what to expect. Magnifying his grief, he spotted the same group of Japanese as earlier, watching the proceedings through the open doorway. Again, the man with the crew cut made eye contact. Again, Edward looked away. Suddenly, he realized what the officials were up to, bestowing them plaques featuring their names, ranks, and an inscription of appreciation. The recipients were asked to speak. What the hell? Wasn't this hard enough? Most of the survivors were too choked up and could only offer a frail thank you. When they came to Edward, the Admiral saluted him and handed him the plaque. "Would you give us the honor of saying a few words?" he asked, raising the microphone. Trembling, Edward peered at the Admiral, then at the audience. He spotted Mary sitting in the front row between his friends Jimmy and Smitty. Behind them were Seaman Perez, Ensign Johnson, Chief Petty Officer Polanski, Lieutenant Michaels, Captain Benyon, and 100 other sailors, all looking like youngsters compared to the 7 survivors. Edward's mouth dried up. He couldn't swallow, and he felt like a broken-down, unrepentant liar. If past events had turned out differently, he would have been honored and overwhelmed with gratitude. Edward returned the plaque to the Admiral. "I can't," he whispered, wiping tears from his eyes. I don't deserve it." Relying on his cane, he hurried down the ramp, avoided a stunned Carolyn and Nicole, and rushed past the Japanese families. With his scars tormenting him, Edward crossed Kalakaua Avenue at the signal. The light changed and a waiting vehicle honked impatiently. He stepped onto the beach, but had difficulty maintaining his balance. Endless miles of blackness confronted him, but the sound of waves eased his nerves. To the west, the lights of a ship reflected across the water. He assumed it was a dinner cruise, an activity Nicole had expressed an interest in. He hadn't been on a ship since the attack and wasn't about to start now. Farther west lay Pearl. He flinched. Today had verified his deepest fears. Returning had indeed opened old wounds and attracted unwanted attention. Back at the hotel, Edward felt too restless to return to their room. The Hawaiian music from Aloha Harry's stirred his curiosity, and he decided to give the bar a try. He flopped down on a stool and situated the cane in his lap. The bartender, wearing a red lei, white shirt, and black tie, stepped over. Peering at Edward's name badge, he asked, "What's your pleasure, Mr. Edward Wilson?" Even though Carolyn had given her blessing, he still felt guilty after ordering a Mai Tai. One drink shouldn't hurt. If he started growing fangs and claws, then he wouldn't finish it. The bartender returned and placed the drink in front of him. "You're a West Virginia survivor, aren't you?" Edward forced himself to cringe. "That's what they tell me." The man gave a thumbs-up sign. "No charge," he said. "Thanks for your service." Edward sipped his drink, but felt no pleasure. It seemed like he hadn't enjoyed anything since Mary passed away. He would never have guessed he would outlive her. Brain cancer, fast spreading, 58 years of marriage, down the drain. He wished it were him. The same Japanese party as before entered the bar. The man with the crew cut again peered at him and nodded. Once more, Edward turned away. How strange. What was the guy trying to do? It was 70 years too late to strike up a friendship. Someone reached over and set the anniversary plaque in front of Edward. He turned and discovered Carolyn and Nicole standing behind him. "Dad, what do you think you're doing?" Edward pushed away the Mai Tai. "You said it was okay." "I think she means walking out like that, Grandpa," Nicole said. "It kind of put the kibosh on the festivities." Edward shook his head. Now he felt ashamed. "I don't know how to explain." The Admiral told me you said you didn't deserve the plaque. Carolyn took his arm. Come on, Dad, let's go. Whether you like it or not, we're gonna talk. Edward closed the door to their suite's bathroom and peered into the mirror. Mary stood before him, beautiful as ever. What am I gonna do? He asked. Carolyn's forcing my hand. Go talk to her. It'll just make things worse. Mary shook her head. You worked for the phone company, fire department, and then as a painter. Which one did you like the best? Don't you remember? Painting. That's because you're good at covering things up, especially your pain. Mary's image gradually disappeared, but her voice lingered. Go talk to your daughter. It'll help. Carolyn set Edward down on the couch and, standing over him, crossed her arms. Unlike Mary, when something rattled his daughter, she hit the warpath. His granddaughter plopped down on the chair opposite them, the plaque snug in her lap. Are you mad at me? Edward asked, his voice quivering. No, Dad, but Nicole and I are worried. I've come to realize that I grew up in a dysfunctional home. Like I said yesterday, I remember hearing you from across the hallway, screaming in your sleep. Mom told me to let it go, that you would sooner die than talk about your war experiences. When I saw the burns on your back, I was shocked. You weren't only scarred mentally, but physically. So after all these years, all the naval reunions you've snubbed, you're saying you don't deserve any acknowledgement? Why, Dad? Why the hell not? Edward lowered his eyes. I can't talk about it. Carolyn leaned forward until they were face to face. No one is leaving this room until everything's out in the open. Mom put up with this. I won't. Edward sank into the couch, wishing he'd finished the Mai Tai. He stared at the picture on the wall above Nicole, a poster of the Arizona before Pearl Harbor, looking proud and majestic. Carolyn wasn't taking no for an answer. After all these years, maybe it was time to give up. When we were attacked at Pearl, my buddy Jimmy and me were reassigned to fire control. It was utter chaos on deck, like something out of hell. Guys were getting killed everywhere. Our ship was hit by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Before we were ordered to abandon ship, a torpedo hit our position. Jimmy, my best friend, was nearly ripped in half with shrapnel. Even after 70 years, unbearable pain swept through Edward. He was standing just 6 feet from me, 6 lousy feet, and I wasn't even scratched. How's that possible? I figure his body must have shielded me. Something broke inside him and he couldn't hold back any longer. I carried what was left of Jimmy. I carried him off the ship. Carolyn sat down on the coffee table in front of Edward and took his hands. That's horrible, Dad, worse than I imagined. No wonder you have nightmares. But Jimmy's death wasn't your fault. I believe in destiny. You were meant to save lives as a firefighter, marry Mom, and bring me into this world. I don't understand, Grandpa, murmured Nicole. If you weren't even scratched, how did you get the scars? Edward's blood turned to ice. The West Virginia was burning out of control, just like a lot of other battleships. It sank on an even keel in shallow water, the deck still above the surface. A bunch of us volunteered to go back after the evacuation to put out the fires. We were doing pretty good until the Arizona's leaking oil ignited and engulfed our ship. I was caught off guard and ended up in the hospital with 25% of my body burned. They said I was lucky. I spent months recovering. My sailing days were over. The Navy wanted to discharge me, but I chose desk duty for the duration. Because of that fire, I fought in the war for 1 damn day. That's why I don't deserve recognition. The deserving ones are those who died, like Jimmy and Smitty, or those who fought bravely for months at a time, or even years. Carolyn squeezed her father's hand. Look, Dad, it took a lot of courage for you to go back and fight those fires, especially after what happened to Jimmy. I've always looked up to you just being at Pearl Harbor, but now more so than ever. You're a courageous man and deserve every award imaginable. You've grieved all this time because of the attack, and instead of feeling ashamed, you should hold your head high. Be proud of your life and proud of who you are. Nicole stood, approached them, and handed Edward the plaque. I've always been proud of you, Grandpa. I've always looked up to you. Forcing back tears, Edward accepted the plaque. "I have just one question," his granddaughter probed. "What went on with you and drinking?" Edward shook his head and sat back. "I used to be a drunk, an abusive, miserable drunk." Carolyn stood. "Wait a second, Dad. That's not right. I remember. You did some drinking for a while, no doubt from what happened to you at Pearl. One night when I was acting up, you raised your hand like you were going to slap me. Mom had a fit. You quit drinking that same night. That was 42 years ago. But you never struck me, and you certainly never hit Mom." "I didn't. I can't remember." "Mom always bragged about you, how you were such a good father, husband, and provider." Carolyn leaned forward and peered into his eyes. "Now how about being good to yourself for a change?" Utilizing his cane, Edward stood, his legs trembling. He reached over and gave Carolyn a firm but tender hug, and then, turning to Nicole, hugged her. Without a word, he nodded goodnight and ambled to his room. He collapsed onto the bed, and with the plaque beside him, slept the best since he was 18 years old, peacefully, without dreams or nightmares. By morning, the pain of his scars had vanished. Honolulu International Airport, December 12, 2011. 2011. Edward returned from the men's room and sat between Carolyn and Nicole at their boarding gate. Nicole gave him a peck on the cheek. "Thank you, Grandpa. I had a great time." He nodded and chuckled. "Good, honey. I had a great time, too." What baffled Edward was his honesty. Something happened on that night of the reunion. It seemed impossible, but he'd been given a second chance at life, to say farewell to his demons, express his feelings, and accept his past. Edward had surprised himself, holding up so well during their visit at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. Otherwise known as the Punch Bowl, it had been built into the crater of an extinct volcano overlooking Honolulu, Waikiki, and Diamond Head. It was a gorgeous cemetery with its mosaic walls, manicured trees, and perfectly aligned markers. It was as if Carolyn had been there a dozen times before, guiding him to the graves of Ernie Pyle, Admiral Waldo Christie, and most importantly, his friend Jimmy. True, Edward shed a few tears, but this time he wasn't ashamed. Instead of shutting down, he felt grateful for having known such a wonderful person as Jimmy. Sitting back, Edward glanced around the airport. He spotted the same group of Japanese as before, heading toward another gate. There were 12 in all, at least 2 families. The man with the crew cut walked in the midst of them, appearing preoccupied and exhausted. It seemed inevitable, but their eyes met again. This time, Edward fought the urge to look away. The man broke from the group and headed toward them. Feeling guarded and unsure of himself, Edward didn't know what to think. Leaning on his cane, he rose to his feet, hoping the man would turn and head back to his companions. But he kept walking toward them until he and Edward stood face to face. "I am Masato Kuroda," the Japanese man whispered. "I was at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He drew a heavy breath. I know your pain." "You don't know anything," Edward screamed inside his mind, reeling in a state of shock. "You attacked us and killed my friends and shipmates." But he held in his entire 88 years, he'd never spoken to a Japanese person. Masato bowed his head and then peered directly into Edward's eyes. "I regret that day." Edward's mouth dropped. His stomach lurched. Trembling, he asked, "What did you say?" Carolyn and Nicole joined him, their faces colorless, their eyes enormous. Huddled together, the Japanese man's companions silently inched toward them. Masato reached over and hugged Edward, a gesture both profound and sincere, one that knew no bounds, and to all those who observed, an endeavor that challenged a lifetime of anguish. "I regret it all," Masato whispered. A sense of tranquility rushed through Edward. Wobbling, he dropped his cane and hugged Masato in return.
A terrific amount of creative writers and poets. It's just awesome. So this one's called After the Bridge is Down. I burn my bridges. I use a lighter and gasoline. I want no one following me. I demolish any evidence of the thing. Then I stand by to watch the ashes disperse like gray dandelion fluff. So much for that one. I get in my car and go. Maybe I walk. I just know I leave. Sometimes I stop and look back. The smoke cloud marks my thoughts. Why did I feel the pain? I've crossed so many bridges, enjoyed breathing in their warm and acrid smoke. I don't plan to leave a trail, dark and sooty underfoot. I don't sit hunched in alleys looking for my next victim. I build them, stick by stick, frame by frame, good, strong structures, the perfect bridge to burn. Thank you.
It's called Roxie's Got PTSD. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Rob took a deep breath. The world around him wobbled. He felt the horizon rise. The sun roared up at him. He lost track of the ground, and then he fell. The panic didn't hit him until after he'd hit the granite, and by then he realized he'd just tipped over. He hadn't fallen off El Cap. Well, technically he had fallen. He had fallen from standing on the top of El Cap to lying on the top of El Cap. But he hadn't fallen off El Cap, which was a good thing. He felt a giggle escape his throat. Ultimately, he was up here to fall off El Cap. It didn't matter in the end if he fell or jumped, he'd end up falling all the same. The point was for him to fall off or jump off or whatever when he was ready. That was the important part. After all, he had to be able to pull his chute. If he fell and didn't pull his chute, he'd be nothing but a smear of red within 13 seconds. Gary would be ticked about that. Gary was already ticked, but Gary owed Rob, and Rob was collecting on that debt. Rob didn't want Gary to have to watch him jump to his death, though. For everything that Gary owed Rob, the price wasn't that steep. Rob struggled to get off his back, conscious that he was smashing his chute, something he didn't like doing. Man, getting old sucked. When had he gotten so fat and out of shape? Finally, Rob made it onto his side. Before him lay the gallon jug of water he had bought at a gas station just outside the park. The cap had cracked, and all the remaining liquid was nothing but a dark patch on the gray rock. Well, it shouldn't matter. After all, he wasn't going to take the water with him when he jumped, and he was at the top now. Technically speaking, he no longer needed it. He would get some more water from Gary when he landed in El Cap Meadow. But deep down where Rob didn't like to visit, the sudden dearth of water unnerved him. It was boiling outside, and with no water, his hand was forced. He would have to jump. He was too far into the back country to walk out without water. The world continued to bend at his vision's edges, and he was tired. No doubt due to the 8-mile hike from Tamarack Campground to El Cap. He reminded himself he was in his 50s now. He was no longer a spring chicken. Man, how that galled him. He turned 50 this past May. His body was falling apart. His best years were behind him. And what did he have to show for it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, except for a bunch of meaningless medals the Army had given him. The medals were for, what were they for? They all blurred together, even though he knew he could just kick the fog from his brain. He'd be able to tell you not only every one he had, but when and where he had been when he earned them. Now, though, Rob still lay on his side, the world an oppressive hug, and something was digging into his hip. The acute discomfort of this pierced the blanket of sleep that was settling on him. He squirmed and shifted so he could pull the pill bottle from his pants pocket. The name Roxie shone up at him from the label. He had Roxie to live for, but somehow that made him sadder. It wasn't like Roxie was a faithful wife or a loving daughter. Roxie was his 65-pound German Shepherd. The VA doctor, Dr. Agarwal, a short, buxom lady with long black hair and nut-colored skin, had told Rob that a dog could help him with some of his post-traumatic stress disorder. And the dog could perhaps provide a tether to the world. Wouldn't it be nice to come home to someone who's happy to see you every day? Someone who will love you regardless? Someone who sees you as the center of their universe? She'd said, her plump lips distracting him from her words. Rob felt a lot of things as a member of the female sex talked to him about faithfulness and love. He wondered if Dr. Agarwal saw her husband as the center of her universe. He doubted it. After all, she was working in a VA, of all places, the hotbed of violent, demented, unhinged males with issues. No doubt she put her career before her family. He glanced at her wedding band. He wondered if it was even real or if she was just one of those women who wore a ring to ward off male advances. Not that he would have advanced on Dr. Agarwal. He had nearly 20 years on her, and she had a weird last name. Now, he wasn't racist, he just didn't find anything outside traditional American values appealing after Vietnam. The point was, he never thought about what Dr. Agarwal looked like without her white coat on. And he had gotten a dog, Roxie, but he'd specifically chosen a German Shepherd because Gary had suggested it. My man, Gary had said, after Rob had mentioned possibly getting a dog. They'd been in Gary's basement, drinking beer and watching the Browns game. Rob's father had been a Browns fan, so Rob was too, even though his father had died when he was 13, and Rob had grown up in Nebraska. If you get a dog, get a big dog. Why, Rob asked, stuffing a handful of chips into his mouth. Trish, Gary said the name softly, pointing up toward the ground floor. Trish was his wife Deb's totally nutso miniature schnauzer. The thing was deranged. It had bitten Rob twice for absolutely no reason. And on top of being a serial assaulter, it was gross, with long rust-colored fur that hung from its snout. Rob always felt the thing was a walking example of just what would happen to a man's beard if he let himself go. Trish is prescribed benzos. Rob cocked his head but didn't say anything. They help her too. She's been on them for 3 months. Have you not noticed? Rob shrugged. He didn't give a crap about that dog, but had figured the reason it hadn't bitten him lately was because he had taken care to avoid it. Look, if you get a big dog, and the dog were to need some sort of anti-anxiety medication, it would need a bigger dose. Rob and Gary had both tried to get the VA to give them prescriptions for Xanax. Dr. Agarwal had told Rob that she didn't think Xanax would help him based on his past struggles with addiction. Gary's doctor had told him the same thing. The several stints they'd both done in rehab made it nearly impossible to get the VA to prescribe them anything. Your doctor is setting you up to hit a homer, Gary said. She won't prescribe you benzos, but I'll bet your future dog's vet will. So Rob had gotten Roxie. He'd found her in a shelter, as he didn't qualify for a military issue service dog. Apparently Vietnam had been so long ago, and he had been living for so many years without a dog that the guys getting out of the so-called Gulf War apparently needed one more than him. Rob had a lot of feelings about that too. But getting Roxie from a shelter meant he could get her as an adult and make a pretty convincing case that she needed a little vitamin B. He'd told the vet that Roxie seemed to be suffering from some sort of PTSD from her days in the shelter. He was worried about her. The vet hadn't even blinked. He'd written a prescription for diazepam before Rob could even, before Rod had even begun to describe the specific terrors that Roxie had no doubt been subjected to. I can't believe that worked, Gary said the next Sunday as they both sat on Gary's couch, stoned out of their minds on Roxie's benzos, and the TV on, and the evil Steelers up 4 against Green Bay. I know, Rob said, his body melting into the couch. I'm glad that vet gave Roxie the benzos, or I'd be ripping ticked about the score right now. It didn't take them long to figure out that Roxie could go to multiple vets, and they could get multiple times the benzos. And soon, Roxie had prescriptions for all types of benzos, from diazepam to lorazepam, from all types of vets. Gary and Rob's Sunday afternoons got a lot more fun. That had been last fall, and as May approached, with the big 5-0 looming over him, Rob had begun to wonder what in the world he was doing with his life. None of his 3, or 4 if you count the aborted engagement, marriages had lasted. He had no children. He worked as a carpenter for a construction company that mostly built fast food chains. He had been in rehab at least twice that he could remember, and the only things he remotely cared about in this world were Roxie and Gary, in that order, and the Browns. How had Rob's life arrived at this point? As he mulled that question over, Rob realized that at some point there was one more thing he cared about: getting an adrenaline high. He had, after the war, become heavily involved in risk-seeking behaviors, as termed by the VA docs. He had done drugs, he had raced motorcycles, jumped off things, gambled, had copious amounts of contact with random women. The doctors would tell him all this stemmed from both his genetic makeup as well as his experiences in war. What a stupidly simple term for something so violently complex. The doctors encouraged him to find healthier outlets, which he never did, but somehow, over the course of 50 years, he had slowed down to the point of becoming practically stagnant. He no longer raced motorcycles, although he did use his to get to and from work. He no longer blew coke, although he did abuse alcohol, marijuana, and now Roxie's benzos. He no longer stayed up all night playing roulette and fooling around, although he would play online poker and fantasize a lot. He no longer base jumped. There was no although with that one. He and Gary had been in all this stuff together. And when they had gotten out, they had moved to Sacramento, gotten construction jobs, and started skydiving on their weekends. They'd done some jumps in the Army, but only for training. They had both agreed that the rush was, while nothing close to what you got in a firefight, a good second for the civilian world. They quickly established a routine for their summer weekends, banged out of work and up Route 50 to Tahoe on Friday night, jumping out of planes all day Saturday, and gambling and picking up women on Saturday night. They'd wake up Sunday morning nursing hangovers and coming off whatever high they'd had the night before, eat a plate full of eggs and bacon at whichever casino they were nearest, and then they'd drive home wearing dark glasses with hats pulled down low. Then in the fall of 1978, with the Tahoe skydiving season coming to a close, one of the local skydivers invited Rob and Gary to his house to see a film that had been made about something called base jumping. Rob and Gary went, and they watched the footage of 4 men jump off the massive rock known as El Capitan. The men seemed to fall forever, nearly hitting the ground before finally pulling their chutes and landing in the grassy meadow at the monolith's base. Rob knew immediately that he would become a base jumper, and he did. He base jumped for over a decade. His last jump had been in the spring of 1991 at the Perrine Bridge in Twin Falls, Idaho. He had been drunk, and as he'd stepped off the bridge's railing, the familiar and addictive rush blowing through his stomach and into his chest, he'd realized that he hadn't tied his shoes before jumping. His brain struggled through a thick haze, scrambling to remember what possibly fatally important thing he had forgotten to do besides tie his shoes. Luckily, he'd done so many jumps that even while his conscious brain fought to override the drugs he'd pumped into it, his body knew the drill. His hand pulled the chute. It deployed. Oh, thank the Lord, it deployed. His chute had deployed, and as he drifted to the ground, it dawned on him that his world had shifted. He finally realized he was an addict, and it could kill him. Instead of backing off the alcohol and drugs, though, Rob tabled base jumping and telling himself he would go right back to it just as soon as he got sober. And here he was now, fat, 50, and too blotto to stand, lying on his side, chute strapped to his back, on top of El Cap, that voice deep inside him screaming that he had never gotten sober, so he should not be here now. He was here, though, because he'd been staring at the number 50 for almost 6 months, and he'd been scared to death. He was scared he'd wasted his life and that he was a has-been. He was here to prove to himself that he wasn't, that he still had a future, that he wasn't just a slow shuffle to the grave. Yet, despite his most urgent yearnings, he was hopeless, stoned, out of water, and stuck between a rock and the open air. He was everything he feared, a pointless failure. Rob forced himself upwards. If he was going to fail, it wouldn't be because he hadn't had the guts to try. Gary sat on his tailgate. His eyes darted from his watch to the road, to the top of El Cap and back again. Gary was not happy Rob had roped him into this. At their age, they had no business base jumping. Besides the fact they were out-of-shape addicts with probably a host of undiagnosed health issues. Rob was out of practice, and everyone who was anyone knew the Rangers loved to bust base jumpers. If Rob didn't die, he would probably be arrested, all of which was going to complicate Gary's day. But Rob had saved Gary's life, practically a lifetime ago, but still, it had happened. Rob had never demanded Gary repay the favor until this. Until Rob decided he was going to get in touch with his long-lost self by throwing himself off a 3,000-foot cliff with only a parachute he hadn't used in almost a decade to save him. Gary was unhappy. His eyes flicked to the road. No Ranger rigs. To El Cap. No chute. To his watch, 8:24. The sun had set. He felt a lot of things about this moment, but what monopolized his thoughts were, he's late. He lay awake in the bed of his truck, his eyes on the top of El Cap. It was nearly midnight and Rob had yet to show up. This meant one of two things. He was either at the top or he was at the bottom. If he was at the top, he was alive. If he was at the bottom, he was dead. The likelihood of him being somewhere in between was so infinitesimal that he didn't consider it as realistic. Either way, come morning, Gary would have to make a decision. The right decision would be to call the Rangers. The wrong decision would be to drive home. He knew what he would do. He just didn't want to do it. At 5:15, Gary turned on his headlamp. He got out of his sleeping bag and put his battered camp stove on the tailgate of his truck. Slowly, because he hoped that if he moved slowly enough, somehow he would give Rob the time he needed to appear. He lit the gas and put on the kettle. He watched the kettle because he remembered his mom telling him, a watched pot never boils. When the water did boil, he dumped the grounds in it. It wasn't fancy, but he'd had enough cowboy coffee in his lifetime not to care. All he cared about was giving Rob the time he needed. Gary poured himself a cup of the sludge and dragged himself onto the meadow, clicking his light off as he moved. The sky was lightening. He had told himself he was going to drink the cup, then get in his truck and drive to the ranger station. He didn't want to report on Rob, but Rob had put him in a bad situation. Either Gary snitched and started to search for Rob, or Gary left and was a coward. Gary guessed that being a snitch was better than being a coward, but hot damn, he was ticked at Rob. Gary got halfway through the meadow before turning to face El Capitan. It really was stunning at this angle. There was no doubt about that. He clutched his coffee, the warmth of the plastic mug pleasant on his fingers in the early morning air. It was still cool now, even though come 9 a.m. it would be searing. Gary thought about the last time he had stood here, sometime in the 1980s, after he and Rob had jumped. They had been young then and insane. He was surprised either of them had lived to see the new millennium. Gary gazed up at El Cap, the sky becoming a lighter shade of gray with each passing second. How interesting sunrises were, he thought. Suddenly, something as steady as the night changed in a matter of seconds, from black to light in no time at all. As Gary stared, his focus on the sky lining El Cap, he saw a flash of white. Gary's eyes snapped to the white. The speck grew and relief flooded Gary. A wave of it crashed over him so strongly he fell to his knees. The white was a parachute, and he would recognize that chute anywhere. It was Rob sailing down from the heavens. Rob was alive. When Rob's feet hit the El Cap meadow, a surge of relief and joy passed through him. He'd spent the night on the top of El Cap, struggling through a drug-induced fog. His emotions had ping-ponged from high to low in the long, slow hours, and he'd been up there at that time. By the time he'd decided to jump and had been able to stand, it had been too dark. He waited for morning, his mind spinning over what it was he was going to do with his life once he alighted in the meadow. And now that he was here, he didn't think about what was next. His old Yosemite base jumping instincts kicked in. Instead of thinking, he was stuffing the chute and preparing to run to where he knew Gary had parked the truck. And then Gary appeared, running through the meadow towards Rob, his face split with a wide grin, his bulk bouncing under his oversized hoodie. "I thought you'd eaten the big one," Gary said, making it to Rob. "It was close. I was messed up bad up there," Rob said, realizing both he and Gary were panting. "Oh, God, I was about to go to the Rangers," Gary said, suddenly feeling lighter and happier than he had in years. "I jumped as soon as there was light," Rob said, stuffing the final bit of chute into his pack. "Come on, we got to get out of here before someone calls the fuzz," Gary said. They shuttle ran as fast as they could to Gary's truck. Gary pushed the stove into the bed, slammed the tailgate, and jumped into the driver's seat. He started the truck, Rob in the seat next to him, and they accelerated west. "I can't believe you did that," he said, all of his anger melting away. "I can't either," Rob said, his heart still beating fast. "You're insane," Gary said. "We're insane," Rob countered. They giggled helplessly for a while before Gary finally said, "I'm glad you're okay. I was really worried." Rob inhaled. "I was too, but I feel better than I have in years." Gary laughed. "How messed up are you?" Rob said, "I'm completely sober. I threw Roxie's benzos off the top before it got dark. I haven't started a day without drugs since the last time I was in jail." Gary shook his head. "It's a Yosemite miracle. But how do you really feel?" "Physically, bad. But beyond that, I feel I could actually have a future."
The title is This is Unrequited Love. It was love at first sight, at least for me. I could see that we'd be great together. And I thought, of course, my lovely did too. Not wanting to take a chance on losing, I educated myself, reading books, asking trusted friends their expert advice, scouring the internet for the best ways to nurture this budding relationship. I put my lovely in the finest light, gave proper spacing, proper attention, not wanting to crowd, but instead create a matrix for love to blossom and grow. I thought I did my best, being careful to not be overbearing, overbold, or overwatering the relationship, desperately trying to avoid the pain and suffering of repeated failure, that God-forsaken feeling of defeat, the aching forlorn of paradise lost, hoping beyond hope, fervor beyond fear, keeping my enthusiasm in check. Sadly, as quickly as it came, it died. And so once again, with sighs of resolve, I picked up my dead, withered orchid plant and shaking my head, toss it in the trash.
Those tantalizing reds, we have this right place? It'll stay there now. Those tantalizing reds. From grocery bins they beckon, plump in their ripe beauty, round and full of nature's textured nectar, begging to be thumped, hefted, and carried home. One now sits on my kitchen counter, reminiscent of home long ago and Mom. Oh, how she loved her watermelon. In the heat of July, she'd buy 3 or 4, one for now, the others to cool on the grass under draped towels with hoses dripping, cool water dripping down their smooth sides. After she'd serve our slices, we'd eat and laugh as the red juice dribbled down our fingers and ran in sticky streams down our arms, juice the color of her hair. Then came the summer, the kitchen floor. I can see better without this. Then came the summer, the kitchen floor wore through. Those two cosmic events, Mom's love of melon and the worn linoleum floor, lie ever entwined in my mind. New floors cost money, and Dad's pockets were bare. But Mom was an artist and also a redhead. These two facts explained a lot. First, everything she drug from the kitchen until on empty floor her canvas appeared. Pale charcoal in hand, she sketched a half melon, its rind radiating out to the edges of the room. Then she gathered her artistic supplies, palette, brushes, tubes of multi-hued paint. She'd paint over the worn and old with fresh smelling and new. Dawn found her mixing greens of emerald, spring leaf, and thyme, blending just the right shades for the melon's outer shell. The greens crept into each corner. Under the crevices by the sink, around the stove which refused to move, under the windows overlooking her garden. Then she edged with a circle of pale mist, which separated the rind from the empty center core. Now it must dry, so she could kneel on the greens all around to paint the red center, which would dominate the floor. Then, like a goddess creating the earth, she moved around the orb, applying loving strokes of red vermilion, bits of scarlet, touches of crimson. A day passed, then another, as she blended her colors to watermelon perfection. As dusk approached on the 3rd day, she mixed final swirls of pale yellow with softest cloud white. Pushing strands of auburn hair back from her freckles, she observed her creation. A few more black seeds needed there. Another here? No, just like that. Looking over her work, she beheld a melon worthy of Eden's first garden, and she pronounced her artwork good. Yes, Mom loved her watermelon, and never was there a daughter more blessed than I, because I had a kitchen painting, red-headed Mom.
As Ellen and I walked toward a nursing station, a large patient shoved a smaller one to the floor, proceeded to punch him. I didn't know their names at the time, but the aggressor, Eric Bowman, was a longtime browbeater, and the victim, Donnie Sharp, was supposedly an unrepentant, spoiled brat. I started toward the brawl, but Alan held me back. Let the staff take care of it, he advised. 3 employees rushed out of the break room and separated the patients. Eric was physically escorted to his bedroom, while the victim, Donnie, was taken to the medication clinic, blood dripping from his mouth. He'll be all right, Alan assured me. Let's head to our office and go over the schedule. I shook my head. I'll meet you there. I want to check on the injured patient. Client, Alan corrected. We call them clients now. He'll be fine, but go ahead. The medication psych tech, Mayanne, an African-American woman in her late 50s, had to stop preparing the client's 12 o'clock pills to attend to Donnie. May dabbed a generous amount of Benadine to the laceration on his bottom lip. Then, with a wad of gauze, applied pressure. Even a rookie could tell the wound needed sutures. Would you like me to call the doctor, I offered. Yes, thank you, May replied. Just dial the operator and have her page Dr. Nugent. I picked up the desk phone and completed the call. As we waited for the unit physician, May had the client hold the gauze on his lip while she continued setting up the medications. I sat on the counter of the desk and asked the young man his name. Donnie Sharp, he answered in a squeaky voice. I nodded. That's a good name. He laughed and nearly dropped the gauze. Thank you. His 2 upper front teeth were missing, no doubt to his previous injuries. Blood started to cake on what remained of his teeth. I would find out later he was 24 years old, but appeared to be 11 or 12. By the way he talked, presented himself, and gazed at me, I realized he had the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. What's your name? He inquired, appearing proud of himself for asking. He had a way of looking at a person, as if he were regarding an enormous Christmas present. I'm Jerry Harden, I offered my hand, and we shook. He possessed a weak grip and was barely able to hold on. His arms were thin, with very little muscle tone. I'm happy to meet you, I continued. Do you get in a lot of fights? Donnie sat precariously on a metal stool. His coordination barely existed, and every now and then he had to adjust his balance. Mulling over my question, he shrugged his frail shoulders. Yeah, I guess so. His answer stirred my curiosity. He wore a green plastic helmet, a common precaution for seizure patients. His head wasn't shaped quite right, a little lopsided and smaller than normal. He had sparse hair and scar tissue over both eyebrows, which made him look like a battered prize fighter with a record of 0 and 99. The color of his eyes were a sparkling shade of green and were alert, bright, and full of wonder. He bore a sizable scar on the left side of his forehead. The backs of his hands and arms were covered with scars. I had seen a lot of heart-wrenching cases in those 8 years of state service, but nonetheless, Donnie was a bona fide catastrophe. So why do you get into so many fights, I inquired. Donnie pointed at the hallway. They pick on me. Common occurrence in state hospitals. The strong preying on the weak. Of course, it was up to the staff to protect them. Want to be sure what he meant, I asked. What do you mean by they? His response struck a chord inside of me. All the bad kids, they bother me. May halted setting up the medications and turned our way. He keeps standing up to the bullies we got around here. God help him. Gets his butt whipped every time. She shrugged and chuckled. He's got spunk, I'll say that. But he's more of a lover than a fighter. Apparently Donnie found her remarks hilarious and burst out laughing. No offense intended, but his laughter sounded more like the braying from a boisterous barnyard creature. You're a funny man. Does staff protect you? Donnie shifted around on the stool, trying to keep the gauze on his lip. Sometimes. May continued placing medications into little plastic cups arranged on top of a stainless steel cart. They do what they can. Half of them are just plain lazy. Worthless, if you want to know the truth. She turned and peered at me, her expression dark and serious. I gotta warn you, you're gonna have your hands full around here. I have seizures, Donnie confessed, his tone oozing with misery. Yep, bad ones, May agreed. Grand Mal. Maybe the worst in the hospital. Right, Donnie? Yeah, really big ones. His face turned bright red, no doubt humiliated by his dilemma. He then swiveled around in the stool. I don't like seizures. I nodded. I can't blame you. He smiled and peered into my eyes. You're a nice man, Jerry. I like you. His response not only floored me, reaffirmed what I had to do. Unit 15 was a clean and popular unit, with some of Letterman's more capable clients, but on the downside, a very active and violent place. I only hoped I was up for the challenges of supervising the day shift. The doctor rushed in. Alan called on the phone, searching for my whereabouts. May assured me they would take good care of Donnie. So I hurried to the office Alan and I shared. On that day, I learned quite a bit about my new work environment and made one of the few friends I would have on Unit 15. A frail little guy with abundant courage, a squeaky voice, and a green helmet. Thank you.